Good morning. So, how was your exposure to the earlier lectures that I have given? Please give me the feedback so that I can understand whether I am going fast or slow, or whether I am clear about my dictions. So far, till the last lecture, we have discussed up to the Chinese and Japanese gardens and Mughal gardens. Today, I will discuss about different kinds of gardens that we find in the history, that is European gardens. When we classify, we found that European gardens are of a different type and the other gardens are of a different type. So, if you look at this timelines, then you would find first Chinese landscapes, which is ranging from 551 to 479 BC, then Indian landscape, which dates back to 2000 BC, and then Japanese landscape 600 to 1400 AD, then Spanish landscape 705 to 1500 AD, and Mughal landscape is 1600 to 1800 AD. So far we have discussed about these. When it comes to European, just watch Italian, French and English landscape, they almost have grown during the same period of time. And interestingly, even the Mughal gardens also, Mughal landscape styles also evolved at the same period of time. So, what happened historically over the globe is, if you analyze it, you will find that the natural landscapes were very much favored in the Indian, Chinese, Japanese landscapes. The Spanish landscapes evolved, and then when the Mughal garden was evolving, at that point of time in different part of the globe, in Italy, France and England, another set of gardens were being evolved at the same time. Now, let us look at it individually and also try to compare. In terms of timeline for and the social history and the perception of the Italian landscape. The social history was Renaissance. This is the period when we found lots of change came in the ideologies, in breaking away from the traditions, in creation of art forms, creation of architectural forms, creation of literature. This Renaissance period was excellent period which has in fact very boldly deviated. There were sufferings, but there were also creations. At that time, we found Italian landscape evolved. So, the perception of the Italian landscape garden styles are sensitivity of environment. People started realizing that environment is essential, it is prime, and people started exploiting it, exploring it. Almost at the same time, slightly after, when the Italian landscape style started getting evolved, the French landscape style evolved. Historians say, by analyzing the records, the periods, the styles, the elements, the patterns, the materials, that French landscape has to a good extent emulated what Italian landscape style was offering. So, if we look at it this way, Italian landscape, then French landscape started, Italian landscape continued, French landscape continued. At the same time, English landscape also started evolving slightly after the beginning of the French landscape. So, if we now look at the chronology, we will find Italian landscape started, then the French landscape came in, then the English landscape. And let us look at the social history of all three now, one after another. The Italian landscape social history was Renaissance, and the perception was sensitivity of environment. If you recall, in the beginning of my lecture on this history, we said that we will be evaluating it on different aspects, and the landscape styles are of different kinds, and there are different perception, different expressions. The French landscape social history was monarchy, and that there was a dominance of human in this. English landscape, it was imperialism, and then the perception was natural. This makes it different from each other, or rather one another. When the Renaissance came in, environment got explored, exploited. When the French landscape was growing, the monarchy ruled over it, and it tried to emulate what Italians are doing. So there was a tremendous amount of dominance of human in this. You remember that I said that human intervention? Still, all these categories, all these landscapes fall in the category of the third one, third category 3. Refer my first week's lecture. It's category 3, where human intervention is there, but there's a deliberate attempt of creation. Let's look at the site and philosophical aspects of it. Italian landscape, it was mostly built over stepped terraces. The site had wonderful scenic view, and the philosophy was metaphysical. Scale was huge. They could not build, when I'll show you the examples, you'll realize that they could not build such kind of landscapes in small areas like Japanese have done, or even the Mughals have done. French landscape, siting was mostly agricultural lands, and it was apt for performing arts that came in, blended with the landscape, and there was a magnetism in terms of philosophy. That means there was always an enchantment, there was always a surprise, there was always an excitement in the whole landscape. This is how the whole landscape got created. In English, most often the siting of the English landscapes that we find in our historical examples, they were on the countrysides and gardens. The siting was natural countryside views. So when you look at the sites, you'll find that wonderful natural views of the countryside, and the philosophy was romanticism. That made it different. Let me just look at the philosophy of it. Locations are almost similar. They were grand, some in stepped lands, some in flat, absolute flat, some in countryside which is rolling like English. Italians were stepped, and the French were flat, and the English was in the rolling grounds. You may find examples which are also contrary to this, but most commonly this is the scenario. And the philosophy was, for Italian, it was metaphysical, and French was magnetic, and English landscape was romantic. This is what I was trying to hint at in the beginning of the discussion on the history. What is a spatial organization kind? Italian landscape. Architectural view, it always built over architectural views, and the function was for celebration purposes. So the purpose was mostly celebration and showing off their power, dominance. Ownership was in the hands of elites and the popes. Common public did not have much of access to it, so it was mostly for pleasure and entertainment of such elite groups. French landscapes, it was axial view, like cross, very clear, very axial. They were setting for performing arts, blended within it. Of course, the ownership was of the elites. English landscape, it was a broader view, because it goes into the rolling grounds, the countryside, the broader view. Function was grandeur, and the ownership was of imperial groups. Imperial gardens were essentially the rulers, they used to have it. Let's look at the scale. Italian landscape, it is monumental in scale. They were grand, they were large. And the elements were buildings, grottos, sculptures. In fact, you will find that if you compare with other landscape styles, in Chinese landscape, it is time that I should also correlate with those kind of landscapes. In the Chinese landscapes, you will find that such building was always there in very small form. In Japanese landscape, it was all in a low key. In Spanish landscape, the landscape entered into the building forms, in architectural forms. In Mughal landscape, they were sitting side by side, quite often almost absent. Now here in this, the elements that we do see here, the buildings, grottos and sculptures, they become very, very important elements in the whole landscape to give it a character, give it an identity. So in case you are exposed to some kind of landscapes which you have found in the contemporary periods, where you see that there are items, you can always correlate, okay, this is the emulation. I never say the term called copy, nothing is copied. We can always emulate good things, trying to recreate the scenarios. So emulated, if you emulate, even I found that in Calcutta, the so-called Babus, or the rich people, rich Bengalis, who owned large properties and they had large gardens at the backyards. Those gardens were for their own personal entertainment and entertainment of the friends. There I found that there's a very strong copy or emulation of these styles, where statues, not grottos, but statues, and the building forms, the fountains and such things become almost an integral part of this. In the French landscape, the scale is monumental. Since it was a flat terrace, so it was, parterres means parts, the squares, as we do see in our Mughal garden, that Char Bagh, the 4 squares. Here it's not squares, but there are zones, one zone, another part, another part, another part. So they built over different kind of parts, which is parterres, and then the parterres were divided by hedges, and hedges have now become a very common element in our current landscapes. Then English landscape, the scale was monumental, and the rolling lands and the grass lawns were the elements. So what happened is, in English landscape you will find there's all those structures and all, of course they are there, but not in plenty, because in the whole scale of the landscape sites you would find the rolling grounds, the lakes, the distant lakes and such other things are so much dominating that the structure becomes a small element. Okay, we go one by one to these landscape styles just to understand what is there. I will keep the pictures for a little longer duration so that you can also focus at it. Italian landscape. The baseline information, the same style as I am explaining the others. The location is Italy. The period is 1300 to 1600 AD. The latitude is 41.9 degree north to 12.6 degree east. That's the location. And the climate is Mediterranean type of climates, having cool, rainy winters and hot, dry summers, very typical of Europe, but wonderful. European climate is one of the climates which almost all over the world people like, they enjoy, they always refer it back to if we had European climates. Clear skies, cool yet sunny, such. Terrain is essentially, it's on the southern slope of southern part of the Europe. Here it comprises long boot-shaped Italian peninsula, southern side of Alps and large plain of the Po Valley islands of Sicily and Sardinia. That is the terrain. It's slightly stepped. What is the architecture kind? Here when I am discussing about architecture of Italian garden, basically I am talking about the architectural styles which got embedded in the garden. I am not discussing about the architectural elements. I am discussing about the architectural styles which almost got represented or cloned within the garden. It's a Renaissance style of garden, very formal, very, very formal, orderly, geometric, symmetric, inspired by classical method of order and beauty. The gardens became grander with time. It grew over time and it became grander and grander and grander. The reason is very simple. If somebody has built one garden, if another ruler or another king or another elite group wanted to show their dominance, they created bigger, grander landscapes. So naturally, over the years, it evolved to a grander scales. But there were incorporation of grottos, statues, water features, and these were essentially to impress the viewers or the owners. First the owners, of course, first the owners, but also to impress the viewers. So what happened is, if you look at the whole architectural style of the garden, in that garden, it is grand, very geometric, very formal. If I compare, this is well fit with or well compared with Mughal styles, but cannot be compared with Spanish, Chinese or Japanese, because Mughal styles are also very geometric, very orderly, very formal. So if you look at it now in terms of timeline, you'll find the Mughal style is growing at one part of the globe at the same time, and the Italian style is growing in another part of the globe at the same time. And very interestingly, nobody emulated each other, but formality came in. As I said, the Mughals have borrowed the concept of this particular squares from Persia, and it is almost a reflection of the carpet designs. But Italian did not do that. They had a large area. Mughals did not have large tract of lands for their landscapes. If you see that all these examples, they are not very as large as English, French or Italian gardens. But the thing is, orderliness, the formality, the geometry, the surprises, the elements that started flowing in. Features. There were historical themes. They used the historical themes. And there was the influence of French Baroque garden. There was. How could French influence Italian gardens? Basically what happened is, as the Italians started first and the French followed through, but they had a common period of rolling down the history. So what happened is, the styles which were growing in French also got emulated in the Italian. So there was almost like a blend of this. Formal intersecting lines, very clearly intersecting lines, and it's on flat. Portraits and geometric pattern beds. So the entire site, the landscape site, was divided into multiple parts, and there were flower beds, and they were very geometrically placed. When I'll show you the examples, then I will point out something more on these. More of evergreen trees and less of flowers. So basically what happened is, there were trees, lots of large trees, and the flower beds were very much in a low key. Use of water feature became one of the prime factor, and the contrast of sun and shade used with shady pathways, that was, basically what happened is, within the whole large landscape sites, they also started finding out niches, small niches, which had pergolas, which had many other items to play with sun and shade. Interesting. Let's look at this. One just simple example of an Italian garden style. Let me point out in this, just follow my cursor. If you look at this, there's a large water body at the end and large vegetations. They took the advantage of this topography from higher to lower, leading from higher to lower. This was very interestingly and intelligently done. And then there were creations of various elements. The steps here, the steps at this point, and there were small flower beds. There were very shaped plants. I will come to this a little later. But if you look at the whole thing, you will find this is the entire thing is an Italian garden. It's not simply the front. What happens today is, our domain of gardening has become so small because of the urban pressure that we somehow try to manage within a small site. But they had plenty of sites because it's in the hands of the rulers, and rulers, wherever they have drawn the line, that's the limit. In fact, it was limitless. So this Italian landscape style became very large, very grand, and overlooking from maybe the king's palace or from some other monuments or some other structure. Let's go into the elements part a little by little. They had the promenades, which was wide, slightly raised, and they had the pathways. It was flanked by clipped edges, and the edges were sometimes slightly higher as hedges. So what happened is that the small low height edges or margins that they have created, so it was something like, you had a promenade, you have to walk from one point to another to experience this, and then you have the edges to define the path, and then after that the greens. And in case the definition of the path had to be slightly volumetric, then the edges were raised to a height that became hedges. and they were very, very precariously maintained and manicured, so clearly done. It's not like, say, in today what happens is, other than the hedges, of course, in many cases we try to keep all these bushes or shrubs slightly in its normal form as it grows, but here it was very, very geometric. That gave one particular style to it. Next, there were hideways within the garden. That means, you remember I said the sun and shade and such situations. The garden is too large, within which they had the hideways. They had the place called retreat, where they could sit, they could converse, they could relax. During inclement weather, they require a retreat, a place for relief. The hideways in garden with a vine-draped pergola or a tucked away bench. If you see now, the seats have come in, the benches. Benches or seats, that is essentially an architectural elements for indoors. Gradually it started coming outdoor. So what they required is a space where they could hide, and they had entire greenery covered with it, with vineyards and all, and then they had the seats. That is the kind of elements that started flowing in. Then the grotto. Grotto is nothing but a sort of enclosure within which they could put any structure, or it may not be a structure but a kind of cave. That is what is grotto. And what they have done is, they have created the grotto and filled it with animal features, animal sculptures and or any other furnishings that they have done. And then comes the fountains, and the fountains which were very, very decorated, and mostly stone fountains, and they were very much ornamental. Okay, and these fountains, they created a kind of ripples in the whole area, and then the water flows from fountain to the next level and then to the next level as cascades. Now this made the whole thing a very interesting feature. If you now compare again with Mughals, yes, they have also done this. They also had fountains, they had spouts, and they also had the rolling water, falling water from one level to another, but it was not very extravagant as this. Battalions went a little extravagant on this in terms of scale, size, the fountains, ornamentations. In Mughal landscape, we don't see ornamental fountains. We have seen chadar. The water came in and rolled down this, creating ripples and making sounds and breaking to droplets. The same thing happens over here, but the ornamental fountains started coming in. Other elements. Italians started bringing in sculpture of gods, goddesses and heroes of the earlier or ancient legends. Now, the whole landscape started being filled with statues. Statues were never a part of any other landscapes we have discussed before. If you recall, in Spanish landscape, we didn't have statues. I am not referring to that coat of lion. The coat of lion was a fountain. They were not really meant for statues. Here, it was a deliberate statues to be placed. Then we have the potted stone urns on which lemon trees are planted. This became another element. This particular element is now an entry to the landscape styles. Originally, they were not there. Let us not confuse it with the wash basins of Japanese garden styles. They had those wash basins for some specific purposes, a ritual, for ablution purposes. Here, the urns, potted plants that came into the garden. The next one is very interesting. It's a topiaries. What they have done is, they created animal forms with the plants. This topiary is a different construction style. In later occasions, when I'll discuss about the construction styles of different elements, at that time I'll discuss this in detail, but still let me give you an idea. Basically what they do is they create a wire mesh. The wire mesh is given a shape of animal, and then at the base they start planting creepers, and the creepers that they let it follow the surface of this wire mesh. And over a period of time, these creepers, properly maintained, properly trimmed, pruned, it starts covering the whole wire mesh and ultimately takes the shape of these animals. This is what is called topiary, and this is one of the very strong landscape elements that we do use wherever we feel fit. But I'll also tell you, not everywhere topiary could be good. Topiary is exciting when it comes to a children's park, maybe a public garden, maybe where common people are suddenly enchanted or excited seeing something of an animal shape with the creepers or with the plants. But this is the entry of the style, one of the elements in our landscape, that's called topiary. And the topiaries generally don't have the flowery creepers, they are green creepers. So ultimately, just look at this particular picture, you'll find it's a picture of a bird which is over a base. Now this is very precariously created. And then is the well planned garden with mature trees at the end. This picture I have shown you once earlier. So basically, just here I am trying to indicate the mature trees at the end, at the backdrop is the one. The Italian garden styles that grew over a period, as identified in the history, is early Renaissance period, then high Renaissance period when the Renaissance became supreme, and then late Renaissance period, gradually decline into the Renaissance. The examples I have just cited here, I am just keeping the slides few seconds so that you can see this. Essentially, the examples that you do find in the early Renaissance is the Medici Villa at Fiesole, the Palazzo Piccolomini, that's what is in Tuscany, very famous one, and then Cortile del Belvedere in the Vatican Palace, Rome, and then the Villa Madama, Rome. These were early Renaissance gardens that grew. And then came the high Renaissance. At that time, Villa di Castello in Tuscany and the Villa dEste at Tivoli, they became very good examples of Italian landscape styles. I may be covering few of them. Then in late Renaissance, Villa della Torre and the Sacro Bosco at Bomarzo. So these three periods ultimately created a kind of landscapes. Let's see, early Renaissance, the Medici Villa, there will be some examples, maybe I will go a little more detail in each of this, slightly slowly so that you can view these pictures and correlate. The Palazzo Piccolomini at Pienza, more of a structure, but if you look at, let me highlight the landscape character, in which there is a very clear pathway, there is a fountain, stone fountain at the center, and there are hedges and there are trees. It makes a very strong geometry in perspectives. Then we have the Cortile del Belvedere in the Vatican Palace, Rome, which is very grand but absolutely flat. Essentially, this landscape style which grew over in this place is very much dominated by the structures and the enclosures. But one interesting thing to be noted is it is the foreground of the structures that enhance the quality of the entire space. What could have been the alternative? Alternative could have been completely covered with pathway, but this one small green carpet, rather I won't say small, one large green carpet at the center makes it a foreground, and ultimately it becomes the base of the entire structure, holds the entire thing and ultimately converges. Because if you look at the color of the structures, the yellow occurs to the brown, within that, surrounded by those kind of color, you have a very green base. That makes it very, very interesting. And then the Villa Madama, Rome, which is a villa. At the foreground we have the garden. Now this is to be noted here. As I said, in Japanese garden it blended well. In Spanish garden the landscape blended well with architecture. In Japanese garden the landscape blended with architecture, and also in Mughal garden to a certain extent it blended, to a certain extent, not entirely. But in these Italian landscapes you will find that they were just opposition of one another. So it was a foreground of the villa, and from there people used to enjoy the landscapes in the front. But it is geometric, you have a path, you have a curves, you have lines, you have right angles, you have other angles, so such things. And in high Renaissance, here the whole landscape was quite grand. The building was not very extensive. So, the idea was to create a good landscape, a large landscape, but all those theory of geometry, formality, hedges, divisions, that remained. And then Villa d'Este at Tivoli, here it is a grandness that has been created by the ruler. If you look at this particular picture, I am just focusing at this particular picture, you will find that they have the grand fountains at this point, and they have the pathway which is leading. Everything is very geometric. We have large trees at the edges, and there is a centrality of axis. There is a symmetry in the whole thing. Now, this is what is the kind of Italian landscape style is. The grandness of vegetation, grandness of pathways, grandness of the structure, grandness of the stairs, grandness of the balusters, everything started playing in, and the grandness of the fountains. In late Renaissance, we have Villa della Torre, in which, now let us look at it again, the grandness remained, the structure in front, a landscape has been deliberately created. Now, it never blended with the structure, it just remained in front as a base. But I will tell you, in my opinion as a landscape researcher, every kind of landscape has something to offer, positive or negative. The reason is, if you recall, I said the landscape has to be experienced by people. Who is looking at the landscapes, and what's the final expression or final experience of the user? So, we cannot say this landscape is good, that landscape is good, or that is bad, that is bad. No, we cannot say, because here what happens is, you are offered a kind of landscape styles historically, you use it, emulate it, modify it, and suit the user's perception. Sacrobosco at Bomarzo, Lazio. Here all those cultures and this kind of stuff started coming in. Very interesting. These cultures, when it was placed somewhere not very orderly maybe, but they became one of the attractive element or attraction elements in the whole landscape styles. So friends, so far I have discussed about the progression of the Italian landscape styles through different Renaissance, early, high and late Renaissance. In the next lecture, I will show you some examples of the Italian gardens, citing the things that I have discussed over here. Thank you.